Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to the grand castles and glittering courts, but to the muddy, unpaved paths of the medieval wilderness. Imagine, for a moment, that you are lost. The sun has dipped below the horizon, casting long, unsettling shadows through a dense, unforgiving forest. The air grows cold, and every rustle of the leaves sounds like a footstep. You have no cell phone, no GPS, and no comfortable wool coat from a chain store. Your stomach is already rumbling, and that nagging feeling, the one that tells you this isn't a fun hike anymore, is starting to creep in. You probably wouldn't survive this for more than a day or two, but don't worry. Tonight, we're going to explore how your medieval counterpart might have fared. We're going to walk through the forgotten survival techniques that were once just life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening live, drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. It's always wild to see how far these sounds travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the chill seep through the thin fabric of your tunic. The world, so familiar in daylight, has become a labyrinth of shapes and sounds you don't recognize. The first, and most pressing, thought is for warmth and safety. Your ancestors would have instinctively known that their most immediate priority was not food, but fire. This wasn't just about a cozy blaze, it was about survival on a foundational level. A mainstream historical fact you might not consider is that fire was the primary method of water purification long before anyone understood germs. Without it, even a seemingly clean stream could be a death sentence, full of parasites and bacteria that would make you so sick you'd be unable to move, let alone survive. The lack of clean water was, in a very real sense, a far greater threat than an angry bear. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit is how they'd go about it. Forget your modern ferro rod or a box of matches. A medieval peasant would have likely carried a small flint and steel, but if they lost it, they'd resort to friction. The hand drill method, which you've probably seen on a survival show, was surprisingly effective but required an immense amount of patience and practice. You'd need a fireboard, a flat piece of dry, soft wood, and a spindle, a straight stick of harder wood. The friction created by rapidly spinning the spindle against the fireboard would create a tiny pile of hot, black dust called char, which could be coaxed into an ember. It sounds simple, but you'd be a sweating, frustrated mess before you got even a wisp of smoke. A truly skilled woodsman, though, could do it with remarkable speed. Historians still argue whether the common folk of the early Middle Ages had a reliable, widespread way to carry fire with them, like in a small, tinder-filled container. Some scholars believe that villages were often so close together that you could simply borrow a hot coal from a neighbor, making personal fire-making tools a less critical possession than we might think. Others argue that this would be too risky and that almost every person would have possessed at least a flint and steel, as a travelling coal could easily go out, leaving you stranded. Regardless, the psychological comfort a small fire would bring is something we can all understand. It's a beacon in the darkness, a warmth that keeps the shivers at bay, and a tiny, flickering shield against the imagined horrors of the night. It's the difference between a restless, terror-filled night and a chance to rest and gather your strength. And as you huddle close, you start to feel a tiny bit of hope. The fire is your first victory. As the fire crackles and spits, you begin to feel a warmth spreading through your core, but a new, more insistent feeling starts to gnaw at you. Hunger. You know you can't survive on fire alone, no matter how comforting it is. Your next task is to find something to eat. And in the dense, wild woods, that means turning to the bounty of the earth itself. The medieval peasant, unlike you, would have had an intimate, instinctual knowledge of the flora around them. Passed down through generations of necessity, foraging wasn't a hobby, it was a life or death skill, a constant, low-level hunt for edible greens, roots, and berries. A mainstream historical fact is that many plants we now consider weeds were once staples of the rural diet. Dandelions, for instance, were a critical source of vitamins and minerals. The leaves could be eaten raw or boiled, and the root could be roasted and ground into a coffee-like substitute. Likewise, nettles, despite their sting, were a fantastic source of nutrients. They could be boiled or dried to remove the stinging hairs and then used in soups or stews. Even the common mallow, with its unassuming leaves, was a key ingredient in broths and was known to be a mild diuretic. These weren't just snacks, they were the difference between a full belly and a grumbling one, between a healthy body and one weakened by malnutrition. A quirky detail is the medieval forager's dread, a term I just made up, but you get the idea. It was the fear of mistaking a safe plant for a poisonous one. Hemlock, for example, looks remarkably similar to wild carrots or parsley when it's young, but a single bite could prove fatal. The consequences of an identification error were immediate and irreversible. This led to a system of folk wisdom and rhyme, like if the leaves are like a feather, you'll be dead by stormy weather for a certain poisonous fern, passed down from parent to child. It was a kind of oral botany textbook, a living document of trial, error, and survival. It's the reason why some foraging knowledge was guarded fiercely within families. Historians still argue whether the average peasant truly possessed a vast and encyclopedic knowledge of every single plant in their area. Some scholars contend that their knowledge was highly localized, focusing only on the most common and useful plants within a mile or two of their village. They wouldn't have known about a rare herb growing on the other side of the forest. Other historians believe that traveling merchants and wandering healers helped to spread this botanical knowledge, creating a shared, if imperfect, understanding of the natural world across broader regions. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, a patchwork of deeply personal and communally shared wisdom. You, however, have none of that. You're standing in the woods, looking at a cluster of red berries, and you have to make a choice. Are they safe, or are they the last thing you'll ever eat? You probably decide to stick to what you know. Nothing. It's an overwhelming feeling, realizing that all your modern knowledge, from calculus to celebrity gossip, is utterly useless here. The only thing that matters is what you can find with your own eyes and hands. You realize that your ancestors' minds were trained differently, honed by a constant engagement with the natural world, a kind of biological supercomputer that we've lost. You look down at a patch of clover, and you remember a vague fact from a childhood book. Clover is edible. Not exactly a feast, but it's a start. You chew on a few leaves, tasting the faint bitterness, and you've taken your first tiny, hesitant step into the role of a medieval forager. It's not a meal, but it's a whisper of hope, a signal to your body that you are, for now, surviving. With your stomach now only slightly less empty, you turn your attention from the gentle clover to the more substantial challenge of acquiring meat. For a lone traveller in the medieval woods, a direct confrontation with a wild animal, say, a territorial boar or a swift deer, is an incredibly risky proposition. You don't have a rifle or a modern compound bow. Your only tools are your wits and your hands. The smart, and frankly, much safer method was not the glorious chase of a Hollywood film, but the patient, almost meditative art of trapping and snaring. A mainstream historical fact is that snares were an incredibly common and efficient way to hunt small game, such as rabbits, squirrels, and birds. These simple devices, often made from twisted plant fibers or animal sinew, were set along known animal trails, disguised with leaves and brush. The goal was to catch the animal without having to be present, avoiding a potentially dangerous struggle and allowing you to set multiple traps at once, increasing your odds of success. It was a game of observation and patience. You had to know where the animals moved, what paths they favored, and how to tie a knot that would tighten just enough to hold without breaking. This was the difference between a feast and another day of clover. A quirky, almost cruel tidbit is the use of deadfalls for larger animals. A deadfall is a trap that uses a heavy object, often a log or a large rock, propped up with a trigger mechanism. When the animal trips the trigger, the weight falls, crushing it instantly. This was a particularly grisly but effective method for hunting things like foxes or badgers. The deadfall's construction was a delicate balance of physics and craft. Too light, and it wouldn't kill the animal; too heavy, and the trigger wouldn't be sensitive enough. It was a macabre form of engineering, and a testament to the ingenuity born of necessity. You, a modern person, might find this brutal, but in the Middle Ages, sentimentality was a luxury few could afford. Historians still argue whether trapping and snaring were skills universally held by the peasantry, or if they were the domain of specialized hunters. Some scholars contend that every villager, from the farmer to the blacksmith, would have had a basic knowledge of setting a simple snare, as it was a fundamental part of providing for one's family. Others argue that this level of skill was too high, and that hunting rights were often restricted to the nobility, forcing peasants to poach or rely on the skills of a village expert. The reality is likely a mix of both, with a basic, practical knowledge being widespread and a true mastery being a respected and sometimes secretive profession. You, however, don't have time to debate. You see a well-worn trail, a small track leading through the undergrowth, and you can only assume it's a rabbit run. You remember a vague image from a survival guide you once skimmed. You try to fashion a simple loop, twisting some long grass together. It's flimsy and weak, but it's a start. You prop it up with a few twigs, a clumsy imitation of a proper snare, and you leave it there. It feels almost foolish, but it's all you can do. As you walk away, you feel the forest watching you, a quiet jury of trees and animals, waiting to see if you have what it takes. The rabbit, if it even exists, is probably laughing at your pathetic attempt, but the act of trying, of actively engaging with the world around you, is a victory in itself. You haven't caught anything, but you've taken another step toward understanding the mind of a medieval survivor. Your pitiful excuse for a snare is now out of sight, and the gnawing hunger is back. But let's imagine, for a moment, that you were successful. You return to find a small rabbit caught in your trap, a tiny morsel of a meal. This is where the next, and in some ways more critical, survival skill comes into play. Preservation. You can't eat the whole thing at once, and without refrigeration, that meat will spoil within a day, becoming a source of sickness rather than sustenance. So, what do? You turn to the ancient, humble arts of salting, smoking, and drying. A mainstream historical fact is that salt was not just a seasoning, it was a cornerstone of the medieval economy and a primary method of food preservation. Salt draws out moisture from the meat, and without moisture, the bacteria that cause spoilage can't thrive. You would have rubbed coarse salt directly into the flesh of the rabbit, packing it into every nook and cranny. For larger game, you'd even inject a brine solution to ensure the preservation reached the bone. The meat would be transformed, losing its fresh, supple texture and becoming firm and intensely salty, but it would last for weeks, even months, if stored properly. Salt was so valuable for this purpose that it was sometimes used as currency, a testament to its life-saving utility. A quirky tidbit is the use of smoking not just for preservation, but also for its flavor and for repelling insects. You would have built a small smoking rack over a smoldering fire of hardwoods like oak or hickory, which burn slowly and produce a thick, fragrant smoke. The smoke's compounds, like phenols and formaldehyde, don't worry, it's a natural thing in wood smoke, would act as powerful preservatives while also making the meat less appealing to flies and other pests. This was a slow process, a kind of patient dialogue between fire and food. The scent of wood smoke, so often romanticized today, was a scent of security and a promise of a future meal. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had consistent access to enough salt to preserve a significant portion of their catch. Some scholars believe that salt was a scarce and expensive commodity, often controlled by wealthy merchants, forcing the poor to rely more on smoking and drying. Others contend that salt production was widespread enough that even the lowliest peasant could get their hands on a small amount, perhaps through a trade with a nearby coastal community or by using natural salt licks. The truth is likely that preservation was a combination of all three methods, with a family's access to resources dictating which one they could rely on most. For you, in the middle of a forest, salt is a fantasy. You have to rely on the most basic of methods, drying. You've already made a fire. Now, you'd need to slice the rabbit meat into thin strips, a gruesome but necessary task, and hang them from a makeshift rack in the sun or over the fire's gentle heat. The process is slow. You're forced to watch and wait as the moisture evaporates, turning the red, soft flesh into tough, dark jerky. It's not a quick fix, and the smell of cooking meat is a constant, torturous reminder of your hunger. But you know that this is the only way to make this tiny meal last. As the sun sets on your second day, you have a small pile of dried meat, a tangible victory, a small, dark testament to your newfound resourcefulness. It's not a feast, but it's a future, with a small, hard wad of dried meat in your pouch. Your mind can finally shift from the immediate panic of hunger to the more subtle, creeping threat of injury and illness. In the Middle Ages, a small cut or a fever could be a death sentence, turning a capable person into a helpless invalid in a matter of days. You don't have a first aid kit, no aspirin, no antibiotics. Your only pharmacy is the forest floor beneath your feet, and your doctors are the plants that grow there. This is where the medieval medicine cabinet, a collection of herbs and folk remedies, would have come into play. A mainstream historical fact is that many common plants were used for their medicinal properties. The willow tree, for instance, contains salicin, a compound similar to the active ingredient in aspirin. Chewing on willow bark was a common remedy for headaches, fevers, and general aches. The plantain, often considered a weed today, was a go-to for poultices. Its leaves, when crushed and applied to a wound, were believed to help stop bleeding and reduce inflammation. And a personal favourite, yarrow, was known as the soldier's woundwort. It has a remarkable ability to staunch blood flow, which made it a lifesaver on the battlefield and a critical tool for any traveller prone to accidents. These weren't just old wives' tales, they were practical, effective, and often the only available treatment, a quirky and frankly stomach-turning. Tidbit is the use of spiderwebs to close wounds. In the absence of sutures, a clean spiderweb could be pressed against a cut to help bind the edges together. The silk, surprisingly, has some antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties, and the natural stickiness would help hold the wound shut. It sounds absolutely disgusting, and the risk of infection was incredibly high. But in a pinch, it was considered a viable, if last-ditch, option. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or an emergency-only remedy. Some scholars say it was a well-known bit of peasant knowledge, while others claim it was a desperate act of folklore that rarely worked. It's hard to imagine, but to a medieval person, a spiderweb might look a lot more like a life-saving tool than a creepy decoration. Historians also still argue whether the medicinal properties of these plants were understood on a chemical level or if their use was based purely on trial and error. Some scholars believe that medieval healers, often referred to as apothecaries or cunning folk, had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of plant properties, a kind of proto-pharmacology. They knew that boiling certain leaves released specific compounds and that a tincture made from one plant was better for a stomachache than another. Other historians argue that it was all a game of chance, with people simply trying remedies until one seemed to work, attributing success to divine favour or sheer luck. It's a fascinating debate, a glimpse into the minds of people who were far more in tune with the natural world than we are today. You, however, are just happy you haven't been seriously injured, but as you walk, you trip and scrape your knee on a jagged rock. It's a small cut, but it's bleeding steadily. You look at a patch of plantain growing nearby, its broad leaves unassuming and green. You remember a vague note about it from some survival show. You pick a leaf, chew on it to release its juices, another gross but necessary step, and then you press the pulpy mass against your wound. It stings for a moment. Then the bleeding begins to slow. It's a miracle. Really, a simple, natural miracle. You've just performed your first act of medieval medicine, and you realize how powerful that knowledge would have been. A kind of living map of health and survival that was written not in books, but in the landscape itself. With your knee poulticed and your hunger temporarily sated, a new, more immediate threat becomes apparent: thirst. You've been walking for hours, and the sun, even through the forest canopy, is making you sweat. You come across a small, clear stream, its water glinting invitingly over smooth stones. Every fibre of your modern being screams to bend down and drink, to gulp the cool, refreshing liquid. But your nascent medieval instincts, the ones we're building, whisper a warning. That pristine-looking stream is a lie, a potential source of sickness and death. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people, especially those in the know, were deeply suspicious of standing water or even seemingly clean streams. They understood, through generations of painful experience, that water could carry illness. The common practice for safe drinking water was to find a spring that bubbled directly from the earth, as this was seen as pure and untouched. But if a spring wasn't available, they had to resort to purification. The most common method, as we touched on earlier, was boiling, but you can't carry a pot around. So the savvy traveller would have carried a water skin and, upon making camp, would immediately boil a supply over their fire to ensure it was safe for the night and the following day's journey. A quirky tidbit is the use of certain plant materials for purification. Charcoal from the fire, for example, was known to help filter out impurities. A simple method was to crush some leftover charcoal from your fire and place it in the bottom of a water container, letting the water sit with it for a while. The charcoal would absorb some of the organic contaminants and sediment, making the water clearer and safer to drink. Another fascinating bit of folk knowledge was the belief that certain fruits or berries could sweeten bad water, not just in flavor, but in a way that made it more palatable and less likely to cause sickness. They didn't understand why, but we now know that some acidic fruits can lower the pH, making it a less hospitable environment for some bacteria. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly understood the concept of waterborne pathogens, or if their avoidance of stagnant water was simply a kind of superstitious folk wisdom. Some scholars contend that a proto-scientific understanding existed, born from the simple observation that people who drank from certain sources became ill. This observation would have been passed down as a hard and fast rule, a survival commandment. Other historians argue that it was all based on folklore and superstition, with people believing that bad water was cursed or inhabited by evil spirits. The truth is likely a blend of the two, a practical rule born from observation, wrapped in the language of the mystical and the religious. You, however, have no time for academic debate. You are parched. You look at the stream, so inviting, and then you look at your still smouldering fire. You remember that little detail about boiling. So, you grab your crude leather water skin and scoop up some of the clear, cold water. You then hold it over the fire, and you hear the quiet hiss as the water begins to heat. The process feels almost sacred, a small ritual of purification. You're not just making water safe to drink, you are actively rejecting the part of your mind that craves instant gratification, choosing instead the patience and wisdom of a life that moves at a slower, more deliberate pace. The water gets hot, and you have to wait for it to cool down. A new kind of torture, but you know it's worth it. When you finally take a sip, it is warm, almost tasteless, and it tastes like survival. With a full belly of dried rabbit and a safe skin of water, your immediate physical needs are met, but you are still exposed to the elements. The sun is sinking, and the air is getting colder. You need shelter, a physical barrier between you and the creeping night, a place to rest without fear of the unseen things that move in the dark. You can't build a log cabin, but you can build a simple, effective structure using what the forest provides. This is the moment you must become a builder, a temporary architect of sticks and mud. A mainstream historical fact is that the most common form of simple, temporary shelter in the medieval period was a lean-to. This was a structure so basic it's still taught in modern survival classes. It requires only a sturdy, low-hanging branch or a fallen log to serve as a ridgepole. From there, you would lean smaller branches and sticks against it at an angle, creating a sloped wall. The wall would then be covered with whatever was available, leaves, pine boughs, or even a thick layer of moss. The goal wasn't comfort or style. It was to create a windbreak and to trap the heat from your small fire. This was a quick and dirty solution, a place to spend a single night. And it was a skill every single person in the Middle Ages would have been able to perform without a second thought. A quirky, and much more labour-intensive, tidbit is the use of wattle and daub for more semi-permanent structures. Wattle is a framework of interwoven sticks, a kind of primitive basketry. Daub is a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes even dung. Once the wattle frame was in place, the daub would be plastered over it, filling in the gaps and creating a solid wall. This was the same technique used for many medieval peasant homes and farm buildings. While you wouldn't have the time to build a whole hut, you could use this method to fortify your lean-to, creating a more robust and secure shelter. It's a reminder that the line between a temporary camp and a permanent home was often just a matter of time and effort. You might even laugh a little, thinking about how you are a one-man construction crew, building a house from the ground up with nothing but your hands. Historians still argue whether the average peasant, if forced to, could build a wattle and daub structure from scratch without the help of a community. Some scholars contend that it was a collaborative effort, a task requiring many hands and a shared knowledge base, and that a single person would be overwhelmed. Others argue that the basic principles were so simple and intuitive that a determined individual could, over the course of several days, build a rudimentary but livable hut. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, a testament to the idea that while communal living was the norm, the skills to survive on one's own were still deeply ingrained. You, however, are a lone wolf tonight. You find a large, fallen log, and you begin the work. You snap branches and drag them to the log, propping them up against it. The process is slow and clumsy, and a few branches slide down, but you persist. You then gather an armful of pine boughs, their scent filling the air, and you lay them over the frame, creating a roof that will shed the rain and keep the wind out. It's not a palace, not even close, but it's yours, as you crawl inside. The temperature instantly feels a few degrees warmer. You can still see the stars through the gaps, but the wall behind you gives you a sense of security. You've just built your own little kingdom in the wilderness, and you realize how powerful that feeling of self-sufficiency truly is. It's a feeling of victory that a hotel room could never give you. You've made it through the night, a small victory in a world that seems determined to defeat you. The sun rises, casting a pale, cold light through the trees. Now, with your immediate survival needs met, you must address the next, more daunting challenge, figuring out where you are and where you need to go. You have no map, no compass, and the forest, which was once a place of terror, now just feels like an endless green labyrinth. This is the moment you must learn to navigate like a medieval traveler, using the sky and the land as your only guides. A mainstream historical fact is that celestial navigation was the most reliable method for finding one's way. The sun, of course, was the most obvious tool. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and this simple and consistent fact could give you a general sense of direction. By observing the length and position of shadows at different times of the day, you could get a more precise reading. At midday, for example, your shadow would be at its shortest and point directly north in the northern hemisphere. This was a fundamental, universal piece of knowledge, a kind of internal GPS that every traveller from a peasant to a king would have relied upon. A quirky, and much more subtle, tidbit is the use of moss and tree rings. You've probably heard the old saying that moss grows on the north side of trees in a dense forest. This can be a helpful, though not foolproof, indicator. Moss prefers the cooler, shadier north side of a tree trunk, so a thick patch of it can point you in a general northern direction. And while you can't exactly cut down a tree just to check, the rings on a tree stump, thicker on the side with more sunlight, can also indicate direction. These were the little whispers of the forest, the subtle clues that, when combined, could form a map in your mind. Historians still argue whether the average medieval person had a deep and intricate understanding of celestial navigation, or if their knowledge was limited to a few simple rules of thumb. Some scholars contend that the peasantry, who lived by the seasons and the sun, would have been deeply familiar with the movements of the stars and sun, using constellations like the North Star, Polaris, as a constant guide. Others argue that this level of knowledge was the domain of professional sailors, astronomers, or a privileged few. They suggest that the common folk's navigation was more about landmark recognition, following a river, a well-known path, or a distant mountain peak. The truth is likely that a combination of both was used, with an intuitive sense of direction guiding them most of the time, and celestial knowledge being used for long-distance, purposeful travel. You, however, are a beginner. You stand in the clearing, squinting up at the sun. It's late morning, so the sun is high in the sky, and your shadow is long and stretches out behind you. You know from a high school geography class that this means you are facing roughly north. It's a small, almost insignificant fact, but in the vastness of the forest, it feels like a revelation. You pick a landmark, a tall, strangely shaped tree in the distance, and you begin walking toward it. It's not the fastest or the most direct path, but it's a direction. You are no longer just surviving, you are moving with purpose, a tiny, determined dot in a sea of green, relying on a skill that has guided humanity for thousands of years. The knowledge feels ancient and new at the same time. A part of you that you didn't even know existed. You've made a little progress, you've got a direction, but the path is still rough and unmarked. As you continue your slow, deliberate march through the forest, you realize how much you miss the modern convenience of tools. A sharp knife, a shovel, a sturdy hammer, all gone, in their place. You have only your hands and the raw materials of the earth. This is where the medieval survivor's most fundamental skill comes to the fore, the ability to create simple tools from the world around them. It's a step back to the Stone Age, a return to the roots of human ingenuity. A mainstream historical fact is that flint knapping, the art of shaping flint into sharp tools, was still a known, if less common, skill. While most people would have had a forged iron knife, a lost or broken tool meant a return to this primitive art. By striking a nodule of flint or chert with a hammerstone, you could create a sharp, jagged edge perfect for cutting meat, scraping hides, or carving wood. It was a messy, dangerous process, a testament to the fact that every medieval person was, to some degree, a part-time caveman. The tools were crude, but they were 1,000 times better than your fingernails. A quirky tidbit is the use of fire to temper wood. By slowly and carefully charring the tip of a wooden digging stick or spear, you could make it harder and more durable. The charred wood, once scraped clean, would be more resistant to rot and wear, allowing it to hold a point for longer. This was a low-tech but highly effective method of improving the longevity and utility of a tool that was otherwise just a stick. The process was a bit like primitive metallurgy, a kind of alchemical transformation of a raw material using nothing but heat. Historians still argue whether the average peasant was capable of creating even these rudimentary tools. Some scholars contend that the skills were so fundamental that every villager would have had a basic grasp of them, passed down from generation to generation out of pure necessity. The knowledge of which stone makes the best blade, or which wood is best for a digging stick, was as important as knowing how to plant a crop. Other historians argue that these were specialized skills, practiced by a village artisan or a woodsman, and that a common person would have been utterly lost without their help. The truth is likely that a simple, functional understanding was widespread, while a true mastery was reserved for the few. You, however, have to be your own expert. You come across a fallen branch, thick and straight, and you pick it up. You see a sharp rock nearby, a piece of broken flint. It's not perfect, but it's a start. You try to imitate the process you once saw on a documentary, clumsily striking the rock, a tiny shard flying off and cutting your hand. You have to admit, this is a lot harder than it looks. It's a humbling moment, realizing that a skill that was once common is now so alien to you. But you keep going, after several tries. You manage to create a somewhat jagged but usable cutting edge. You use it to strip the bark from the branch, turning it into a smooth, raw piece of wood that could be used as a club or a digging stick. It's not elegant, but it is a tool. It is an extension of your body, a way to manipulate the world that was impossible just moments ago. You look at it, a crude but functional piece of humanity, and you feel a surge of pride. Your newly fashioned stick and flint tool is a small triumph, but you know that it's a far cry from what a medieval person would have carried on a journey. You start to think about what they would have considered essential, the medieval equivalent of a bug-out bag. This wasn't a pre-packed kit for a doomsday scenario, but a collection of items a traveller would have on their person, a sort of constant companion for the uncertainty of the road. A mainstream historical fact is that a basic traveller's kit would have included a pouch, a small knife, a flint and steel, and a water skin. The pouch, likely made of leather or linen, was your portable pantry and first aid kit, holding a bit of dried meat, some foraged herbs, and maybe a small piece of cheese if you were lucky. The knife was the most versatile tool you owned, a multi-purpose implement for everything from cutting rope to whittling wood. The flint and steel, as we've discussed, were your fire-making salvation, and the water skin, usually made from an animal bladder or stomach, was your mobile canteen. These were the core four, the absolute essentials, a quirky and somewhat personal tidbit is the use of a pilgrimage token. Many travellers, especially those on a pilgrimage or a long journey, would carry a small lead or pewter badge from a shrine or a holy site. These tokens weren't just souvenirs, they were a form of ID, a proof of a completed journey, and a good luck charm. They were a visible sign of your faith and your purpose, and they could sometimes grant you passage or hospitality where you might otherwise be turned away. They were a mix of the spiritual and the practical, a physical representation of the hope and faith that helped people endure such arduous journeys. Historians still argue whether the common medieval person was a well-equipped traveller or if most journeys were made with very little. Some scholars contend that even a poor peasant would have been so accustomed to travel and hardship that they would always have a small pack ready, a testament to a transient and uncertain life. Others argue that most peasants rarely travelled more than a few miles from their home village, and when they did, they were often so poor that they carried nothing but the clothes on their back. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, a reflection of the vast social and economic differences of the time. A merchant would be well equipped, while a serf might have only a stick. You, however, have nothing, so you start to build your own kit, piece by piece. You fashion a crude pouch from a large leaf and some woven grass. It's not waterproof, and it's certainly not strong, but it holds your dried meat and your new flint tool. You realize that this is what the medieval mind was built for, creating, improvising, and adapting. This wasn't a world of off-the-shelf solutions. Every problem was a puzzle that had to be solved with the raw materials at hand. You are no longer just a passive survivor, you are a maker, a creator. You're building your life, one small, crude tool at a time. And you're starting to understand that this is the real secret of medieval survival. With a small pack now slung over your shoulder, you feel a little more confident. But the reality of the medieval world is that danger is always present. As you're moving through a thick patch of undergrowth, you take a clumsy step and your ankle twists, sending a sharp, searing pain up your leg. You collapse, a cry of pain escaping your lips. A sprained or broken ankle is a serious, life-threatening injury here. You can't just limp to a car and drive to an emergency room. Your mobility is gone, and so is your ability to hunt, forage, or escape. This is where you must become your own doctor, a medieval bone setter. A mainstream historical fact is that immobilization was the primary treatment for broken bones and serious sprains. While they didn't understand the finer points of bone knitting, they knew that keeping a limb still was the best way to allow it to heal. The most common method was to use a splint, usually a straight piece of wood or a sturdy stick, tied tightly to the injured limb with strips of cloth, leather, or even woven grass. This was a brutal but necessary process. You would have had to carefully position the limb, align the bones as best you could, and then tie it all down, enduring the pain for the sake of long-term healing. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit is the use of honey as a wound dressing. We talked about plantain, but for more serious cuts or abrasions that came with the break, honey was a go-to. It was known to have antiseptic properties, and we now know that it's a natural antibacterial. A poultice of honey, sometimes mixed with herbs, would be applied to an open wound to prevent infection. It's a testament to the fact that people were using some remarkably effective folk remedies long before we understood the science behind them. It's a sweet, sticky kind of medicine, and a little piece of nature that could literally save your life. Historians still argue whether the average person's splinting knowledge was effective or often made things worse. Some scholars contend that the people had a deep, practical understanding of basic anatomy and that their splints were often surprisingly effective, leading to successful healing even of complex fractures. Others argue that without a proper medical education, many attempts at splinting were clumsy, painful, and often resulted in permanent deformities or a more serious injury. The truth is likely that it was a hit-or-miss affair, with some people possessing an innate talent for it and others simply doing the best they could with what they had. You, however, don't have time for debate. The pain is a constant, throbbing reminder of your situation. You carefully examine your ankle, and while it doesn't look broken, it's definitely sprained. You find a straight, sturdy stick and tear a long strip from your already frayed tunic. You position the stick along the side of your ankle, and you begin to wrap the cloth around it, pulling it tight. It hurts a lot, but with each knot, you feel a little more stable. You can't stand and walk. Not yet. But you've taken the first step toward recovery. You've become your own doctor, and you have to find a place to rest and let the healing begin. The world is a dangerous place for a person on 2 feet, and even more so for a person with a single working ankle. The long wait for healing is a part of the medieval journey. An enemy as relentless as hunger or cold, limping. You find a small, sheltered clearing beneath a cluster of thick pine trees. The pain in your ankle makes any further travel a non-starter. You need to stop, and you realize that a stationary medieval survivor faces a different set of challenges. You can't hunt or forage as effectively, and you are far more vulnerable. This is where your time must be spent on a different kind of survival, making your temporary home more livable. And that means crafting and improving your supplies. A mainstream historical fact is that cordage, or rope, was one of the most useful and critical tools a person could have. It was used for everything from lashing together a shelter to making snares. And it could be created from a wide variety of natural materials. The inner bark of linden or basswood trees, for example, could be stripped, soaked in water, and then twisted into surprisingly strong and durable cordage. Likewise, nettles, with their tough fibers, were another common source. It was a patient, repetitive process of peeling, soaking, and twisting, but the end result was a tool that could hold your life together, quite literally. A quirky tidbit is the use of animal sinew. If you'd been lucky enough to catch a larger animal, its sinew, the tendons and ligaments, could be dried and separated into tough, stringy fibers. These were often used for finer tasks, like sewing animal hides together to make clothing or repairing your crude pouch. It was incredibly strong and durable, a kind of natural superthread. Historians still argue whether the use of animal sinew was a common practice among all peasants, or if it was a specialized skill for a tanner or leather worker. Some scholars contend that every hunter would have known how to prepare and use it, while others argue that it was too complex a process for the average person. The reality is probably that it was a highly valued material, used whenever it was available. For you, with your sprained ankle. This is a perfect task. You can't move much, so you sit on the ground and start to work with some long, fibrous weeds you find nearby. You remember the basic technique. Take a few strands, twist them tightly in one direction, then fold them over and let them twist back on themselves. It's a clumsy process, and your first attempts are lumpy and weak, but after a few tries, you start to get the hang of it. The repetitive motion is calming, almost meditative, and you start to feel a little bit of pride as you create something from nothing. This is the difference between surviving and thriving, between simply enduring and actively shaping your world. A small piece of twisted grass becomes a strong cord, a simple tool that can be used for 1,000 different purposes. You start to realize that survival isn't just about big, dramatic moments of finding food or building a shelter. It's also about the small, quiet, continuous acts of creation. It's about mending, repairing, and building. Your ankle may be out of commission, but your hands are still working, and that is a victory in itself. You have turned a weakness into a kind of strength, using your enforced stillness to acquire a new, critical skill. And as you sit there, twisting the fibers, you feel a connection to every single person who has ever had to make something out of nothing. You are a part of a long, unbroken chain of human ingenuity and resilience. With your ankle still healing, you have to find a way to make your temporary encampment more livable. You've already woven some crude rope. Now you need a way to carry your meager belongings. Without a backpack or even a decent sack, you are forced to turn to another ancient skill, the art of basket weaving. This wasn't just a craft, it was a fundamental part of the medieval world. A way to transport and store everything from foraged plants to a day's catch of fish. A mainstream historical fact is that basket weaving was a widespread and practical skill, relying on a surprising variety of materials. Willow, reeds, and even split wood could be woven into containers of all shapes and sizes. The most basic technique involved creating a sturdy frame and then weaving flexible strands around it. A method you can see reflected in everything from ancient Roman baskets to modern-day wicker furniture. It was a skill passed down from parent to child, a quiet, almost invisible part of everyday life. The knowledge of which plants were best for weaving and at what time of year to harvest them was a critical piece of folk wisdom, a quirky and somewhat beautiful tidbit is the use of different colors of bark and plant fibers to create patterns. While most baskets were purely functional, a skilled weaver could create intricate, decorative designs by using materials of different hues. A basket made with light willow and dark oak bark, for example, could have a beautiful geometric pattern. This wasn't just for show. The patterns could be a form of signature, a way for the weaver to leave their mark on their work. It was a small act of artistry in a world that was often brutal and unadorned. Historians still argue whether basket weaving was a communal or individual skill. Some scholars contend that it was a collaborative effort, with villagers coming together to weave large baskets for communal grain storage or for a specific task. Others argue that it was a deeply personal skill, with each individual creating and repairing their own baskets for their family's use. The truth is likely that it was both, with the scale and complexity of the project dictating whether it was a solo act or a group effort. You, however, are working alone. You find some flexible willow branches and you begin to bend them, creating a small, circular frame. Your fingers are clumsy, and the branches don't want to cooperate, but you persist. You begin to weave the smaller, more flexible strands of grass and reeds through the frame. Your movement's slow and deliberate. It's a frustrating process, but the repetitive motion is calming, a kind of puzzle that you can feel yourself solving with your hands. You start to see a shape emerge, a small, bowl-like container. It's not perfect, not even close. The weaving is loose in some places, and the shape is lopsided, but it is a basket. It can hold things. You put a few smooth stones inside, and you feel the weight. A physical testament to your hard work. You've just created a tool that can make your life so much easier, a tangible piece of your newfound medieval identity. The basket, in its own way, is a little piece of civilization, a sign that you are not just an animal foraging for scraps, but a creator, a person capable of shaping the world around you, with a crude basket now at your side. You have a means to carry your growing collection of tools and foraged food. The sun is getting low again, and the quiet of the forest is settling in. This is the moment when a different kind of survival becomes important, the survival of the mind. In the long, cold nights, alone and isolated, a person's spirit could break just as easily as their body. This is where the medieval survivor turned to the invisible yet powerful tool of storytelling and community. A mainstream historical fact is that oral tradition was the primary method for transmitting knowledge. There were no books or YouTube tutorials for how to make a fire or what plants were safe to eat. This information was passed down from a parent to a child, from a grandparent to a grandchild, in the form of stories, songs, and poems. A story about a foolish traveller who ate the wrong berries was not just a piece of entertainment, it was a cautionary tale, a lesson in botany wrapped in a narrative. This was how the collective memory of a community was preserved and how critical survival skills were encoded and shared. A quirky, almost mystical tidbit is the use of riddles and rhymes. These weren't just for fun. A riddle about a plant's appearance or a rhyme about a certain animal's behavior could act as a mnemonic device, a way to remember a complex piece of information easily. White berries, not for eating. A simple rhyme could save a life. This was a kind of gamified education, a way to make the dry, life or death facts of the world stick in a person's memory. It's a testament to the power of human creativity and a reminder that even in the grimmest of circumstances, people still found ways to make learning a little bit more engaging. Historians still argue whether the stories of the Middle Ages were a true reflection of the lived experience of the people or if they were largely embellished tales to entertain. Some scholars contend that the stories were a factual and historical record, a kind of living archive of what had worked and what hadn't for previous generations. Other historians argue that they were often distorted by fear, superstition, and exaggeration, and that a traveller relying solely on a folk tale might find themselves in even greater danger. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with the stories serving as a kind of emotional and factual anchor in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable. For you, alone in the wilderness, you start to feel the weight of your isolation. You've been so focused on the physical, but the mental strain is starting to show. You sit by your small fire, and you begin to talk to yourself. You tell yourself a story about a traveller who survived by being patient and observant, a story about a person who found strength in the little things. It feels a little silly, but the sound of your own voice is a comfort. You are not just surviving, you are creating a narrative of your own survival. You are becoming a storyteller, and you are telling a story that you desperately need to hear. This is the oldest form of self-help, a way to build a mental fortress when your physical one is made of sticks. You've just discovered that survival is not just about the body, but also about the spirit, and that the greatest tool you have is your own imagination. Your ankle is feeling a bit better, and with your newfound skills in rope and basket weaving, you decide it's time to test a different kind of survival skill. Now that you've been stationary for a bit, you need to turn your attention to the world around you, specifically the animals that call this place home. You're not looking to hunt them just yet, your ankle won't allow it, but you need to understand them. This is the art of tracking and understanding animal behavior, a kind of silent language that the medieval survivor had to learn by heart. A mainstream historical fact is that every animal left a signature, a trail of clues that, if you knew how to read them, could tell you everything you needed to know. The footprint, of course, was the most obvious. A trained eye could tell not just what kind of animal had passed by, but also its size, its speed, and even how long ago it had been there. A deer leaves a different, sharper hoof print than a boar's rounder one. You'd also look for other signs, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of leaves, or a scat. This was a living log of the forest's inhabitants, a kind of biological ledger that was constantly being written and erased, a quirky and somewhat gross tidbit is the use of scat, or animal droppings, to determine diet and health. A seasoned tracker could tell what an animal had been eating just by examining its waste. The presence of berries, seeds, or bone fragments would give them a clear picture of the animal's diet. This information was critical for a hunter, helping them understand where the animal was feeding and what it was eating. It was a smelly but essential part of the puzzle, a kind of dietary detective work. Historians still argue whether the peasantry's knowledge of tracking was as extensive as that of a professional hunter. Some scholars contend that a basic understanding was widespread. As people had to deal with pests and livestock on a daily basis, they would have known how to track a stray sheep or find a hiding fox. Other historians argue that the intricate, almost academic, knowledge of tracking was a skill reserved for the upper classes and their gamekeepers. As hunting was a sport for the nobility and a luxury the poor couldn't afford, the truth is likely that a peasant knew just enough to get by. While a professional tracker was a master of a dying art, you, with your limited knowledge, decide to practice. You find a patch of soft dirt near your camp, and you begin to look for signs. After a few minutes, you find a small, three-toed print. It's too small for a deer, too big for a rabbit. You rack your brain, trying to remember what kind of animal would leave such a mark. A bird? A large one. You follow the faint trail for a few feet, and you see the prints lead to a small cluster of wild berries, half-eaten. You've just read a story written in the dirt. It's not a dramatic moment, but it's a quiet, powerful victory. You are no longer just a person in the forest. You are a part of it, a careful observer, and a student of its silent, ancient ways. Your ankle is now stable enough for you to move, but you know that simply trudging forward isn't an option. The forest is full of eyes, and if you can see the animals, they can certainly see you. This is the moment you must learn to become a shadow, to blend into your surroundings and move with a quiet stealth that feels alien to your modern sensibilities. This is the art of camouflage and silent movement. A mainstream historical fact is that the colours of a medieval peasant's clothing, the dull browns, greys, and muted greens of undyed wool and linen, were a kind of accidental camouflage. They blended seamlessly with the colours of the earth, making it easier for a person to move through the woods without being seen by either prey or potential enemies. You can't just wear a bright red cloak and expect to go unnoticed. The forest was an environment that demanded you become a part of its palette, a quirky and somewhat humorous tidbit is the use of animal droppings as a kind of impromptu camouflage cream. While it sounds disgusting, the practice of smearing small amounts of mud and animal dung on your exposed skin was surprisingly effective at breaking up the human outline and masking your scent. You'd smell absolutely terrible, but you'd be much harder to spot by animals with a keen sense of smell, like wild boars or deer. It's a reminder that survival in the Middle Ages was often a very dirty business. Historians still argue whether the concept of camouflage was a conscious, tactical skill used by everyone, or if it was just a natural byproduct of a life lived outdoors. Some scholars contend that it was a deeply ingrained part of a hunter's skill set. Taught from a young age, they would have known exactly how to use shadows, and how to move with the wind to mask their scent. Others argue that it was a more intuitive, instinctual knowledge, a kind of animal sense that came from spending a life in the wilderness. The truth is likely that it was a combination of both. a practical skill that was also a kind of second nature. For you, this is a new kind of challenge. You try to mimic the way you've seen animals move. You walk with a slow, deliberate step, testing the ground before you put your full weight down, avoiding snapping twigs. You crouch behind a thick bush, holding your breath as a squirrel scampers past, and you realize that you're starting to see the world from a different perspective. You're no longer just a person walking, you're a potential prey, or a hunter. And every movement has a consequence. You are learning to become invisible, to erase your presence from the landscape. It's a humbling but empowering feeling, a quiet triumph in a world that can be so loud and dangerous. You're not just surviving, you're learning to disappear. You are now adept at blending into the forest, a silent observer in a world of sound and movement. But the reality is that the most dangerous animal you'll encounter isn't a wolf or a bear, it's another human. In the medieval world, the open road was not a safe place. It was rife with bandits, outlaws, and opportunistic strangers who saw a lone traveler as a source of coin, a piece of meat, or both. This is where you must learn basic self-defense, not for a duel of honor, but for the brutal, ugly reality of a life-or-death struggle. A mainstream historical fact is that most peasants and commoners did not own elaborate weapons. A knight had a sword, but you, a simple traveler, would have a much more humble arsenal. A sturdy walking stick, for example, was an incredibly versatile tool. It could be used for balance on a rough path, but it could also be a surprisingly effective bludgeon or a blocking tool. This was the most common form of self-defense. The ability to turn a mundane object into a weapon, a quirky, and somewhat clever. Tidbit is the use of improvised traps and distractions. A person facing a superior force wouldn't fight fair, they would use the terrain to their advantage. A quick shove could send an attacker tumbling down a steep hill. A handful of dirt or sand thrown into the eyes could blind an opponent, giving you a precious few seconds to flee. It was a kind of guerrilla warfare, a testament to the fact that brute strength wasn't the only thing that mattered. Historians still argue whether the average peasant was skilled in combat. Some scholars contend that a life of hard physical labor made them surprisingly tough, and that their familiarity with farming implements like a scythe or a pitchfork could turn them into fearsome opponents. Others argue that most peasants were passive and unarmed, and that their only real defense was to flee or to submit. The truth is likely that a small, determined few were able to defend themselves, but most people's instinct was to avoid confrontation at all costs. You, however, have no choice. You hear voices, a group of men coming down the path, and they don't sound friendly. You hide behind a large tree, your heart pounding in your chest, and you clutch your sturdy walking stick. You are a small, insignificant thing in this world, but you are not defenseless. You are a survivor. You've learned how to read the world, how to make your own tools, and now you must be ready to defend your life with them. You are no longer just a traveler, you are a warrior, and your battlefield is the muddy road. The fear is a physical presence, but you use it to sharpen your senses, to make you more alert, and to prepare for a fight you desperately hope you won't have to have. You've managed to avoid a confrontation, but the close call is a stark reminder of your vulnerability. As you continue your journey, you realize that your tattered tunic and frayed trousers, while providing some cover, are far from adequate. They are a single layer of defense against a world of thorns, sharp rocks, and cold nights. This is the moment you must learn to make your own clothing. A skill that was as fundamental as finding food. This is the simple craft of making primitive clothing and footwear. A mainstream historical fact is that animal hides were the most common material for durable clothing. After a hunt, the hide of a deer, boar, or rabbit would be a valuable resource. It would have to be scraped clean of all fat and membrane, a process known as fleshing, and then stretched and dried, while full-on tanning was a more involved process. A simple, quick method of making the hide pliable was to work it with your hands for a long period, a technique known as brain tanning because the animal's brains, when mashed and applied to the hide, contain emulsifying agents that soften the leather. It's a bit gross, but it works, and it's a way to turn a piece of raw meat into a useful piece of clothing. A quirky, and much more humble, tidbit is the use of woven plant fibers for simpler garments, nettle fibers, for example. could be processed to create a surprisingly strong and coarse cloth. The stalks would be soaked to loosen the fibers, then stripped and woven. The resulting fabric wouldn't be soft or comfortable, but it would provide a layer of protection against the elements. This was a skill that every rural person, rich or poor, would have known on some level. It was a kind of green, eco-friendly fashion born of pure necessity. Historians still argue whether the average peasant was capable of making their own clothing from scratch or if they were reliant on a village weaver or tailor. Some scholars contend that the skills were so fundamental that every family would have had a basic understanding of how to spin thread, weave a simple cloth, and sew. Others argue that this level of skill was too high, and that most clothing was either purchased or handed down, and only repaired by the person who owned it. The truth is likely a combination of the two, with the most rudimentary garments being made at home, and more complex pieces being the work of a professional. For you, this is a new kind of project. You're not going to be able to hunt a deer, but you can try to make a simple pair of shoes. You find a discarded piece of bark and you try to shape it with your crude flint tool. You tear off some long strips of grass and you begin to weave them around your foot, trying to create a kind of sandal. It's a clumsy, uncomfortable process, and the result is a ridiculous-looking pair of shoes that will probably fall apart in an hour. But it is a testament to your ingenuity. You are not just surviving, you are creating a new life for yourself. One piece of clothing, one step at a time. The shoes, for all their faults, are a sign that you are not giving up. Your makeshift bark shoes are a testament to your determination. But as you trudge along, you realize that survival isn't just about the physical and practical. There are times when a little bit of color, a little bit of artistry, can serve a practical purpose. This is where you would turn to the natural world for something more than just sustenance or shelter. This is the simple, yet still practical, art of using natural dyes and pigments. A mainstream historical fact is that color wasn't just for decoration, it had a function. A traveler might use certain colors to signify their status or their profession, and a hunter might use them to create a kind of spiritual or physical connection to the hunt. The most common dyes were from plants. Madder root, for example, would produce a brilliant red, while woad would create a deep, rich blue. Dandelions, as we discussed, could be a food source, but they could also be used to create a vibrant yellow. The process was simple. You would boil the plant material in water, and then you would soak your fibers or your leather in the resulting liquid. A quirky, and somewhat surprising, tidbit is the use of certain insects for dye. The cochineal beetle, while not common in Europe, was a source of a deep crimson dye that was highly valued, but even closer to home. Certain types of snails and shellfish could produce a purple or violet color. These were difficult and labor-intensive processes, but the results were so striking that they were considered a great luxury. It's a reminder that even in a world of limited resources, people still found ways to create beauty. Historians still argue whether the use of natural dyes was a widespread skill or if it was the domain of specialized artisans. Some scholars contend that every family would have known how to make a basic dye for their own use, while others argue that the process was too complex and that most people's clothing was a simple, undyed shade. The truth is likely that a simple, basic knowledge was widespread, while a mastery of the craft was reserved for a few. You, however, are an artist today. You find a patch of wild berries, not the edible kind, but the ones that stain your hands with a deep, dark purple. You crush them in your hand, and you use the juice to create a simple, crude mark on your leather pouch. It's not beautiful, but it is a mark of your journey. You realize that this is a way of leaving a trace, of signaling to the world that you are not just a ghost in the woods, but a person with a story. The mark doesn't serve a physical purpose, but it serves a spiritual one. You are, in a sense, branding your own survival. And you realize that this is what separates a human from an animal. It's the ability to create something for a reason that isn't just about survival. It's about artistry, about leaving a mark, and about telling a story. It's a small, insignificant thing, but in the vast, uncaring wilderness, it feels like a giant, defiant act of humanity. You are not just surviving, you are living, and you're doing it with a little bit of color. Your small, purple-stained pouch is a testament to your newfound artistry. But as you continue your journey, you realize that your temporary lean-to won't last forever. The weather is turning colder, and you need a more substantial shelter, a place you can call home for more than just a single night. This is where you must graduate from a temporary survivalist to a semi-permanent dweller. This is the craft of building a wattle and daub structure. A mainstream historical fact is that wattle and daub was the go-to construction method for most medieval peasant homes. It was a simple, elegant, and effective technique that used only what was available in the local area. The process began with a sturdy timber frame, but the walls were the real magic. Wattle, as we briefly discussed, is a flexible grid of interwoven sticks, a kind of primitive fencing. Daub is the plaster, a thick mixture of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung. This concoction was then smeared and pressed into the wattle framework, creating a solid, insulated wall. A quirky, and a bit gross, tidbit is the use of animal dung. The dung of horses or cattle was a critical ingredient in the daub mixture. It contained fibres that acted as a binder, and it also had a kind of natural adhesive quality. When you think of a medieval home, you probably don't think of a wall made of mud and poop, but this was a reality. A kind of primitive plaster that held together the homes of millions of people. It's a bit of a grim reality check, but it's a perfect example of a society that wasted nothing. Historians still argue whether wattle and daub was a truly durable building method, or if these homes required constant maintenance. Some scholars contend that a well-built home could last for decades, and that it was a surprisingly resilient and waterproof structure. Others argue that the daub was prone to cracking, and that a wattle and daub home was a constant project of repair and maintenance. The truth is likely that the durability depended on the skill of the builder and the quality of the materials. A hastily built home would be a constant headache, while a carefully crafted one could be a source of pride. You, however, don't have a team of builders or a year to spare. You are building a temporary, but more substantial, shelter. You find a spot near a small stream and you begin to gather straight, good, flexible branches. You start by weaving the wattles, creating a series of panels that you will eventually stand upright to form the walls. It's a tedious process, but you start to feel the rhythm of it, a kind of ancient dance between your hands and the natural world. Then you get to the daub. You mix the mud and straw together, your hands sinking into the cold, squishy mixture. You realize that a medieval home wasn't just built, it was sculpted, a collaboration between the builder and the earth itself. As you smear the daub onto your wattle frame, you feel the gritty texture, and you start to imagine this simple wall keeping you warm and safe from the coming cold. You've just built your own castle, and it's 1,000 times more impressive than a modern house, because you did it with your own hands. Your wattle and daub wall is a work in progress, but you've already started to see the potential in using every part of your natural surroundings. As you continue to build, you realize that the animals you've been hunting aren't just for food or clothing. They are a source of a surprising variety of tools and materials. This is the moment you must learn to use animal bones and sinew for something other than a meal. This is a return to the oldest form of human craftsmanship. A mainstream historical fact is that bone was a highly valued material for tools. The femur of a deer or the rib of a boar could be broken and sharpened into a needle, a scraper, or a simple awl for punching holes in leather. It was a durable, strong, and readily available material that could be shaped with a bit of fire and a sharp stone. A bone needle, for instance, was critical for sewing hides together to make a more durable coat or for mending a torn pouch. It was a kind of natural plastic, a perfect example of a society that couldn't afford to waste anything, a quirky and a bit magical. Tidbit is the use of animal hooves and horns for glue. By boiling the hooves and horns in water for a very long time, you could create a thick, sticky liquid that, when cooled, became a powerful adhesive. This was a kind of medieval superglue, used for everything from mending a broken tool handle to creating a stronger bond on a weapon. It's a bit of a gross process, and the smell was likely horrific, but the end result was a life-saving tool that could keep your world from falling apart. Historians still argue whether the average peasant was capable of creating these bone tools and glues, or if this was a specialized skill. Some scholars contend that the knowledge was widespread, and that every family would have a small collection of bone tools for daily use. Others argue that this was a difficult, time-consuming process that was only undertaken by a village artisan, a kind of bonesmith. The truth is likely that a simple understanding was common, but a true mastery of the craft was reserved for a few. For you, this is another lesson in patience. You find a large bone from your last meal, and you begin the painstaking process of scraping it clean with your crude flint knife. You then try to sharpen one end, carefully grinding it against a rock. It's a slow, repetitive process, but you start to see the bone taking shape. You're not just making a tool, you're transforming something that was once a part of a living creature into a part of your own survival. You've just performed a kind of alchemy, a transformation of the natural world into a tool of your own design. It feels powerful, a little bit like cheating, and a little bit like a sacred act. And you realize that your survival isn't just about what you can find, it's about what you can create. Your newfound skills in boneworking are a step towards self-sufficiency. But you're a social creature at heart. Your isolation, while a source of newfound strength, is also a constant threat to your sanity. This is where you must consider the ultimate medieval survival technique, the community itself. In a world of wolves, bandits, and famine, the village was not just a collection of homes, it was a fortress, a shared resource, and the single most important factor in your long-term survival. A mainstream historical fact is that every medieval village was a kind of self-contained ecosystem of skills and labor. The blacksmith made the tools, the weaver made the cloth, the farmer grew the crops. No one person had to be an expert in everything. You might be a terrible hunter, but your neighbor might be an expert trapper. You could trade a day's labor in the fields for a bit of cured meat. This was a system of interdependence, a kind of unspoken social contract where a person's value wasn't just in what they could produce for themselves, but in what they could contribute to the whole. A quirky and somewhat beautiful tidbit is the concept of a shared commons. This was a piece of land, often a forest or a pasture, that was communally owned. The villagers could gather firewood there, graze their animals, or forage for wild plants. It was a shared resource that ensured that even the poorest person had access to the basic necessities of life. This was the original social safety net, a kind of collective ownership that transcended individual property rights. It was a reminder that in the Middle Ages, survival was a group effort. Historians still argue whether this communal structure was a true utopia or if it was rife with petty squabbles and social hierarchies. Some scholars contend that the village was a harmonious, cooperative unit, a place where people worked together for the common good. Others argue that it was a constant battle for resources, with the powerful hoarding land and the weak being exploited. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with the village being a complex social organism, capable of both great kindness and deep cruelty. You, however, are an outsider looking in. You come across a small village, smoke rising from its chimneys, the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer, a welcome change from the quiet of the woods. You have a choice. Do you approach them, risking suspicion and potential hostility? Or do you continue on your own? A lone wolf in a dangerous world. You decide to risk it. You walk into the village, and you realize that you're not just a person anymore. You're a potential asset, or a potential threat. You have nothing to trade but your story. And you realize that your story is a kind of currency. You're no longer just surviving, you're becoming a part of a community. And that, you realize, is the single most powerful survival skill of all. You've made it to the village, and the reality of collective survival is starting to sink in. But what happens when the collective faces a threat it can't simply outproduce or outtrade? What happens when winter descends and the ground freezes over, making foraging impossible and travel a brutal, life-threatening ordeal? This is where you must learn to survive in extreme weather, a skill that was as much about ingenuity as it was about brute force. A mainstream historical fact is that a medieval winter was not just a season, it was a period of near total lockdown. Rivers would freeze solid, and roads would become impassable. The village would be forced to rely on what they had stored up during the warmer months. This is why preserving food, as we discussed earlier, was a matter of life and death. The winter was a time of rationing, of mending tools, and of hoping that your supply of cured meat and dried grain would last until spring. It was a test of a community's foresight and their ability to work together. A quirky and somewhat beautiful. Tidbit is the use of snow itself for insulation. A person or a family caught in a blizzard might dig a temporary shelter into a snowdrift. The snow, when packed tightly, is a surprisingly good insulator. The air trapped within the snow crystals would keep the cold out and the body heat in. This was a classic piece of folk wisdom, a kind of primitive snow cave construction that could mean the difference between freezing to death and surviving the night. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasantry had a deep understanding of seasonal weather patterns. Some scholars contend that their entire lives revolved around the seasons, and that they had a kind of deep, intuitive knowledge of when the first frost would come, or when to expect a heavy snow. Others argue that they were at the mercy of the elements, and that a surprise blizzard or a late thaw could spell disaster for a whole village. The truth is likely that they were both deeply knowledgeable and still incredibly vulnerable. A fragile balance between preparation and the sheer unpredictability of nature. You, however, are now in the village. You've been given a small corner to sleep in, a place by the fire. You watch as the villagers prepare for the coming cold. They are not panicking, they are simply doing what they have done for generations. They are mending their clothing, sharpening their axes, and stockpiling firewood. You realize that your solo journey was a microcosm of this larger reality. Every piece of dried meat, every piece of knowledge you acquired, was a small preparation for a world that was always a step away from disaster. You've just learned that survival isn't just about the heroic moment of a single-person journey, it's about the patient, quiet, and collective work of a community. You are no longer just a survivor, you are a part of a much larger story, and it's a story that is told not in words, but in action, in the quiet preparations for a long, cold winter. You are now an embedded part of the village, and you're starting to understand a new kind of threat, disease and hygiene. In your solo journey, a scraped knee was a big problem, but in a crowded, dirty village, a simple cough could turn into a plague. The medieval world was a microbial nightmare, and the methods for dealing with it were often strange, ineffective, and sometimes even dangerous. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine had a very limited understanding of germs. The prevailing theory was the theory of humours, which stated that the body was made of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that disease was caused by an imbalance of these humours. The cure was to restore balance, often through bloodletting, a practice that, while gruesome, was performed by barbers and surgeons alike. It was a kind of primitive, and often wrong, science that governed every aspect of health. A quirky, and very unsettling, tidbit is the use of crocodile dung as a kind of medieval sunscreen. Yes, you heard that right. It was believed to have protective properties and was used by some cultures to ward off skin ailments. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or if it was a fringe, almost magical belief. It's a perfect example of a medical practice that was born of a mix of observation and pure, unadulterated superstition. You probably won't be rushing to try this at home. Historians also still argue whether the common folk had any form of personal hygiene beyond a simple wash. Some scholars contend that people were remarkably clean, bathing in rivers or communal bathhouses. Others argue that most people were incredibly dirty, and that a single set of clothes was worn for months, if not years, at a time. The truth is likely that it was a mix of both, with a basic level of hygiene being practiced, but a modern sense of cleanliness being a complete impossibility. You, however, are now in a village, and you notice the smells, the smell of unwashed bodies, of animals, and of waste. You realize that your personal hygiene, a simple habit you took for granted, is a luxury. You see a family member with a hacking cough, and you feel a shiver of fear. You can survive a sprained ankle, but you are utterly defenseless against a disease you can't even see. You just learned that the most dangerous enemy in the medieval world isn't an animal or a bandit. It's a tiny, invisible enemy that can bring a whole village to its knees. The threat of disease hangs in the air, but the village carries on. As you watch the daily routine, you realize that survival isn't just about what you can find in the forest, it's also about what you can grow. This is where you would turn to the earth itself, to the quiet, patient art of cultivating a small garden plot for food security. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval agriculture was a laborious and often backbreaking task. The most common crops were grains like wheat, barley, and rye, which were a source of bread, beer, and a kind of gruel that was a staple of the peasant diet. But in addition to the large fields, every family would have had a small garden plot, a kitchen garden where they could grow vegetables like cabbages, onions, and peas. This was their insurance policy, a place where they could grow food that was theirs and theirs alone. A quirky and surprisingly modern tidbit is the use of companion planting. Medieval peasants knew, through generations of trial and error, that certain plants grew better when they were planted next to each other. For example, planting beans and corn together would not only give the beans a trellis to grow on, but the beans would also enrich the soil with nitrogen, benefiting the corn. This was a kind of proto-scientific knowledge, a way of maximizing your yield with minimal resources. It was a testament to the fact that people were far more in tune with the earth than we give them credit for. Historians still argue whether the average peasant had a surplus of food or if they lived on a constant knife's edge of hunger. Some scholars contend that the agricultural system, while simple, was so productive that most peasants had enough to eat. Others argue that a single bad harvest could spell disaster, and that most of the year was a constant struggle to get enough food to survive. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with good years being followed by bad, and a family's ability to endure a famine being a matter of sheer luck and hard work. You, however, are now in the village, and you're handed a hoe. You are asked to help with the communal garden, and you feel a connection to a long line of people who have knelt on the earth, planting a seed in the hope of a harvest. The work is hard, your hands blistered and sore, but you realize that this is what true survival looks like. It isn't a dramatic, heroic moment. It's the patient, quiet work of planting a seed and waiting for it to grow. You are no longer just a traveler, you are a farmer, and your future is tied to the soil beneath your feet. The feel of the soil on your hands is a new kind of comfort. But you know that agriculture isn't enough. You still need things you can't produce yourself: tools, spices, or a warm cloak. This is where you would turn to the medieval marketplace, to the bustling, loud, and sometimes dangerous world of bartering and trade. In a world without a universal currency, your survival was often dependent on your ability to exchange what you had for what you needed. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval economy was built on a foundation of barter. A farmer might trade a sack of grain for a tool from the blacksmith. A weaver might trade a bolt of cloth for a piece of meat from a hunter. This was a system of direct exchange, a kind of fluid economy where your value was in your skill and your ability to produce. It was a much more personal form of commerce, a constant negotiation that required trust and a shared understanding of value. A quirky, and a bit of a funny tidbit is the concept of honorable trading. While it sounds like a joke, many guilds and communities had unspoken rules about fair trade. A baker, for example, would be expected to give a fair measure of bread for the grain he received. A trader who was known to be dishonest would be shunned and could even be banned from the marketplace. It was a system that, while imperfect, was based on a kind of social contract. Historians still argue whether this system was truly fair or if it was simply a way for the powerful to exploit the weak. Some scholars contend that it was a remarkably equitable system, where a person's skill was their true currency. Others argue that it was a system where the wealthy hoarded goods and that the poor were often forced to trade at a disadvantage. The truth is likely that it was a mix of both, with the system being as fair as the people who used it. You, however, are now in the village, and you have nothing to trade, but you have your skills. You offer to help a local weaver fix her loom, and in exchange, she gives you a piece of cloth, a warm, woolen square that you can use to mend your tunic. You realize that your skills are your currency, and that your ability to help another person is your true value. You've just learned that in the medieval world, you weren't just a survivor, you were a part of a network of human interdependence, a complex, living web of trade and community. You now have a piece of cloth, a warm and welcome addition to your meager possessions. As you sit by the fire and mend your tunic, you realize that the world of the village is a sensory overload. This is not the quiet, solitary world of the forest. This is a place of loud noises, strange smells, and constant human interaction. This is the challenge of navigating a medieval marketplace, a social survival skill as important as any physical one. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval marketplaces were the social and economic heart of the community. They were a riot of colour, sound, and smell. You would hear the cries of vendors, the hammering of blacksmiths, and the lowing of animals. The smell of fresh bread would mix with the scent of spices, and the pungent odour of animal hides. This was not a sanitized, modern market. It was a raw, unfiltered slice of medieval life. A quirky, and somewhat dangerous, tidbit is the fact that many of the spices and goods were faked. A vendor might mix sawdust into a spice to make it go further, or they might sell a cheap, fake fabric for the price of a more expensive one. It was a buyer beware kind of place. And your ability to spot a fake was a survival skill in itself. Historians still argue whether the marketplace was a source of social cohesion or a place of constant conflict. Some scholars contend that it was a communal space where people from all walks of life could interact and exchange ideas. Others argue that it was a place of petty crime, of cheating, and of constant competition. The truth is likely that it was a mix of both, a place where the best and worst of human nature were on full display. You, however, are a spectator. You watch the villagers interact, and you start to learn the unspoken rules. You see who is trusted and who is not. You learn that a firm handshake is a form of contract, and that a verbal agreement is as good as a written one. You are not just observing a market, you are observing a society. You are learning the language of trade and trust, and you realize that this is a new kind of survival, a social one. You are learning to read people, and you realize that this is a skill that will serve you just as well as any in the wild. You've started to understand the rhythm of the village, and the next lesson in survival comes from an unexpected source, your meal. As you eat a bowl of stew, you notice it's a bit sour, but the flavor is deep and complex. You realize that this is a key part of medieval food preservation. You are tasting the product of fermentation, a survival technique that was as much an art as a science. A mainstream historical fact is that fermentation was a critical method for preserving food and making it safer to eat. The fermentation process, which uses bacteria and yeast, creates an acidic environment that is inhospitable to the harmful bacteria that cause spoilage. This was how they made bread, cheese, and, most importantly, ale and beer. These were not just alcoholic beverages, they were a safer alternative to water that was likely full of contaminants. The fermentation process killed the pathogens, making the drink safe to consume. A quirky and a bit magical tidbit is the concept of wild yeast. Medieval people didn't have packets of yeast to add to their bread or beer. They relied on the natural, wild yeast that was present in the air and on the surfaces of everything. A baker would simply mix flour and water and leave it out to ferment, letting the wild yeast do its work. This was a kind of a trust fall with nature, a leap of faith that the invisible world of microbes would do their part to make your food safe and delicious. Historians still argue whether the medieval person understood the biological process of fermentation. Some scholars contend that they had a kind of proto-scientific understanding. Born from observation and experience, they knew that a certain temperature would make the fermentation faster, and that a certain starter would produce a better result. Others argue that it was all based on folklore and superstition, with people believing that the process was a kind of magical transformation. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with a practical knowledge being passed down through generations, wrapped in a layer of mystery and folk wisdom. You, however, are just tasting the result. You are eating a piece of bread that is a living testament to a process that has been used for thousands of years. You are drinking a bowl of stew that has been made safe by the invisible work of microbes. You've just learned that survival isn't just about what you can find or what you can build. It's also about what you can transform. You are no longer just a consumer of food. You are a part of a much larger and much older cycle of creation and preservation. Your stomach is now full of fermented goodness, and you have a new appreciation for the simple science of survival. As you look around the village, you notice a strange structure jutting out from one of the walls of the great hall. It's a stone extension with a small hole at the bottom. This is a garderobe, the medieval equivalent of a toilet, and it's a testament to the fact that even in the Middle Ages, people were thinking about waste management. A mainstream historical fact is that hygiene, while not a priority in the way we think of it today, was not completely ignored. The garderobe was a common feature in castles and manor houses. It was a simple toilet, a stone seat with a hole that dropped the waste directly into a cesspit, or, more often, a moat. This was a surprisingly efficient system for dealing with human waste, a kind of primitive plumbing. It was a clear sign that people, especially the wealthy, were aware of the need to keep their living spaces free of waste. A quirky, and a bit of a grim, tidbit is the job of the gong farmer. This was a person who was paid to clean out the cesspits and garderobes. It was a dangerous and disgusting job, and the gong farmer was often a social outcast. But it was a critical part of the medieval sanitation system. This was a necessary but unpleasant task, a kind of quiet hero of the medieval world, ensuring that the waste was taken care of. Historians still argue whether the common peasant had a similar system for dealing with waste. Some scholars contend that the villages were often incredibly dirty, with waste simply being thrown into the streets or into a communal pit. Others argue that they had a more rudimentary but still effective system, with a designated area for a latrine or a communal toilet. The truth is likely that the level of hygiene varied greatly from village to village and from person to person. You, however, are just thankful you don't have to use a hole in the ground. You realize that your modern sensibilities are a luxury, and that even a simple toilet was a sign of a society that was starting to think about its own health and well-being. You've just learned that survival isn't just about the heroic acts, it's also about the quiet, mundane, and often gross realities of everyday life. You've learned that a garderobe, in its own way, is a kind of civilization, a simple but powerful tool for keeping a community healthy. Your journey through the village has given you a newfound appreciation for collective living. But now you must consider a more formal aspect of medieval survival, the apothecary and healing. This wasn't a village doctor, it was a person who dealt in the more refined and sometimes dangerous world of medicine. A specialist who could turn the herbs you foraged into powerful, and sometimes deadly, concoctions. A mainstream historical fact is that the apothecary was the closest thing to a pharmacist or a medical professional in the medieval world. They would have had a deep knowledge of a wide variety of plants, minerals, and animal parts, and they would have known how to prepare them into poultices, tinctures, and potions. They were the gatekeepers of medical knowledge, a source of last resort for a serious illness or injury. A quirky, and a bit of a strange, tidbit is the use of mandrake root. This plant was believed to have magical properties and was often used in folk remedies. It was a potent anesthetic, and it was also believed to be a cure for a wide variety of ailments. However, it was also highly poisonous, and a person who took too much could easily die. It's a perfect example of a plant that was both a cure and a poison, a testament to the fine line between medicine and magic in the medieval world. Historians still argue whether the apothecary was a true medical professional or a glorified herbalist. Some scholars contend that they had a deep, and often accurate, understanding of plant properties, and that their remedies were surprisingly effective. Others argue that they were simply a purveyor of folk remedies and superstitions, and that their success was more a matter of luck and the body's natural healing abilities. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with some apothecaries being true healers and others being little more than charlatans. You, however, are just a patient. You watch as the apothecary, a wizened old woman with gnarled hands, mixes a poultice for a villager with a festering cut. She is not just a healer, she is a chemist, a botanist, and a kind of magician. You realize that your own primitive first aid was a pale imitation of this. You are in a world where a person's life could be saved by a single plant, and you are starting to understand how powerful that knowledge would have been. A kind of living, breathing encyclopedia of health and healing. You are now in the world of the apothecary, but you know that even with all their knowledge, a single mistake could be fatal. This is the challenge of identifying poisonous plants and fungi, a life-or-death skill that was a constant part of the medieval survivor's reality. One wrong choice could be the last choice you ever make. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the most common wild plants had a toxic doppelganger. Wild carrots, for example, look remarkably similar to hemlock, a poison so potent that it was used in ancient Greece to execute prisoners. Likewise, some mushrooms, while looking like a delicious meal, could be deadly. The destroying angel, a mushroom that looks like an edible field mushroom, contains toxins that can shut down your liver and kidneys in a matter of days. This was a constant, terrifying risk, and a reason why a forager had to be a master of their craft, a quirky and a bit of a grim tidbit is the use of animal testing. A person who was unsure about a plant or a mushroom might feed a small piece of it to an animal to see if it was safe. A dog, a pig, or even a bird would be a kind of primitive food taster, a test subject to ensure the food was safe for human consumption. While it sounds cruel, it was a necessary and common practice. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant had a comprehensive understanding of all the poisonous plants in their area. Some scholars contend that the knowledge was passed down through generations, and that a child would have been taught from a young age which plants to avoid. Others argue that this level of knowledge was too high, and that accidental poisoning was a common occurrence. The truth is likely that it was a combination of both, with the general knowledge being widespread, and a true mastery being a respected, and sometimes secretive, skill. You, however, are not an expert. You are just a person who is trying to survive. You see a cluster of mushrooms, their white caps looking like a delicious meal, but you stop. You remember the stories, the cautionary tales, and you walk on. You've just made a choice that could have saved your life. You've learned that survival isn't just about what you can do. It's also about what you choose not to do. It's about a kind of a quiet, deliberate caution, a respect for a world that is as beautiful as it is dangerous. You are no longer just a forager. You are a student of the landscape, a person who is learning to read the quiet, and sometimes deadly, language of plants. You've made it through another day, and you've learned a valuable lesson in caution. As you sit by the fire in the village, you notice a group of men gathered around a large vat, the air thick with the smell of brewing. This is the craft of brewing beer and ale, a skill that was as much a social art as a survival technique. It wasn't just for fun, it was a way to make a safe and calorie-rich liquid in a world where clean water was a luxury. A mainstream historical fact is that beer and ale were a staple of the medieval diet. The fermentation process, which we've already discussed, made the drink safe to consume by killing any waterborne pathogens. In a world where a clean water source was a rarity, beer and ale were a life-saving alternative. They were also a source of calories and nutrients, and they were consumed by people of all ages, from children to the elderly. It was not the strong, alcoholic beer we think of today, but a much weaker and more nourishing beverage, a quirky and somewhat personal tidbit is the use of local ingredients. A medieval brewer would use whatever was available to them. While barley was the most common grain, they would also use oats, rye, or even peas. They would use whatever flavorings they could find, from herbs to spices, to create a unique flavor. This was a kind of a local beer scene, a testament to the fact that every village had its own unique brew, a taste of home that was unlike any other. Historians still argue whether the art of brewing was a skill that every family possessed, or if it was the domain of a specialized brewer. Some scholars contend that every household would have had a basic knowledge of brewing, and that it was a common, everyday task. Others argue that it was a complex process that required a great deal of skill, and that most people would have purchased their beer from a local brewer. The truth is likely that a simple, homemade ale was common, while a more complex, professional brew was a luxury. You, however, are now a part of the audience. You watch as the men stir the vat, a kind of collective ritual that has been performed for centuries. You are not just a spectator, you are a part of a much larger and much older story. You've just learned that survival isn't just about the heroic acts, it's also about the quiet, mundane, and often social realities of everyday life. You are a part of a community that is working together to create something that is both a source of pleasure and a tool for survival. You've learned that a single cup of beer, in its own way, is a kind of civilization, a sign that people can not only endure but also find a little bit of joy along the way. You've just witnessed the art of brewing, a testament to collective ingenuity. But the village isn't just about food and shelter, it's also about a more fundamental level of survival, one that you've only touched on. This is the simple art of metallurgy and blacksmithing, a craft that transformed a society from one of stone and wood to one of metal. Without it, your knife and your axe would be useless. A mainstream historical fact is that the blacksmith was a central and highly respected figure in every medieval village. They were the masters of fire and metal, the people who could turn a lump of ore into a tool that could work the land or a weapon that could defend it. The process was simple, but required immense skill and strength. The blacksmith would heat the iron in a forge until it was pliable. and then they would hammer it into shape on an anvil. It was a loud, hot, and dangerous job, a kind of primal art form, a quirky and somewhat magical. Tidbit is the concept of charlatan's magic. A blacksmith was often a kind of wizard to the common folk. They could make a piece of cold, hard metal glow with heat, and then they could hammer it into a beautiful, useful shape. They were believed to have a special connection to the spirits of the earth, and their work was often seen as a form of alchemy. Historians still argue whether the average peasant was capable of simple metalwork. Some scholars contend that every village would have had a shared forge, and that a basic knowledge of metal repair was a common skill. Others argue that this was a highly specialized and often secretive craft that was passed down from a master to an apprentice. The truth is likely that a simple repair was a common skill, while a complex piece of work was a luxury. You, however, are now in the village. You watch the blacksmith at work, the rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil, a kind of music. You've just learned that survival isn't just about what you can make with your hands, it's also about what you can get from someone else. You are a part of a much larger and much more complex system of human interdependence. You've made it through another day, and you've learned a valuable lesson in the power of trade and specialization. But now you must consider a more dangerous aspect of medieval life, superstition. In a world without science, a person's life was often governed by a complex web of folklore, fear, and belief. This is the danger of medieval superstitions, and how they could hinder rational survival decisions. A mainstream historical fact is that many people believed in a kind of divine justice. If a person fell ill, it was often believed to be a punishment from God for a past sin. The cure, in this case, was not a poultice, but a prayer. This was a world where a person's fate was believed to be in the hands of a higher power, and a good harvest or a bad one was a sign of divine favour or displeasure, a quirky and a bit of a grim. Tidbit is the use of witch bottles. A person who believed they were cursed might fill a bottle with their urine, hair, and nails, and then bury it, hoping to trap the curse. This was a kind of primitive folk magic, a way to fight an unseen enemy. It was a testament to the fact that people were so desperate for a cure that they would turn to anything, no matter how strange or illogical. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were a source of comfort or a source of fear. Some scholars contend that they gave people a sense of control over an unpredictable world. Others argue that they were a source of constant anxiety. With people living in fear of a curse or a spell, the truth is likely that they were both. A complex mix of faith, fear, and a desperate hope for a better future. You, sir, however, are a modern person in this world. You see a villager with a festering cut who refuses a poultice because she believes it's a punishment from a spirit. You've just learned that the most dangerous enemy in the medieval world isn't an animal or a bandit, it's a person's own mind. You've learned that survival isn't just about the physical, it's also about the mental, and that the greatest tool you have is your own rational mind. Your time in the village has taught you much, but the reality of medieval survival is that a person's life was often a constant cycle of feasting and famine. You've seen the village preparing for winter, but what happens when the preparations fail? What happens when a siege begins, and the village is cut off from the outside world? This is the ultimate test of survival, a siege. A mainstream historical fact is that a siege was a prolonged, brutal test of a community's resilience. The enemy wouldn't just attack, they would wait. They would cut off the village's food and water supply, and they would wait for hunger and thirst to do their work. A community under siege would be forced to rely on whatever food they had stored up, and the people would be slowly starved into submission. It was a kind of psychological warfare, a slow, agonizing death for a whole community, a quirky and a bit of a grim. Tidbit is the use of starvation bread. In the last days of a siege, people would be forced to make bread out of whatever they could find, sawdust, ground-up bones, or even animal dung. This was not a source of sustenance. It was a kind of psychological tool, a way to give people the illusion of a full stomach. Historians still argue whether a siege was a truly effective military tactic. Some scholars contend that it was a highly effective way to win a battle without a direct confrontation. Others argue that it was often a costly and time-consuming process that could easily backfire. The truth is likely that it was a mix of both, with a long siege often being a gamble for both the attacker and the defender. You, however, are now in the village. You hear the horns of the approaching army, and you know that you are now a part of a much larger and much more dangerous story. You are not just a survivor, you are a defender, a person who is willing to fight for their home and for their life. You've just learned that survival isn't just about a single person's journey, it's about the collective fight of a community. You've learned that in the face of a great threat, a village can become a fortress, and a person's will can become a weapon. The siege is a constant, terrifying presence. The days bleed into one another, and your stomach is a hollow pit of hunger. You now have a deeper understanding of the peasant's diet, a reality that debunks the myths of a happy, well-fed life. The reality of a siege, and of everyday medieval life, was a constant struggle for sustenance. A mainstream historical fact is that the average peasant's diet was incredibly monotonous and nutrient-poor. The bulk of their calories came from a coarse grain bread, often mixed with flour from legumes, and a kind of thick stew or pottage made from whatever vegetables were in season. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions or a successful hunt. The diet was low in protein and vitamins, a constant state of low-level malnutrition that made them susceptible to disease and illness, a quirky and somewhat disgusting. Tidbit is the concept of a pot herb. This was a name for a plant that was grown for its leaves and stems, and it was the primary source of nutrition for a peasant family. A pot of water would be kept on the fire, and whatever was in season, nettles, dandelions, or wild cabbages, would be thrown in. This was a kind of a perpetual stew, a constant source of liquid and a few nutrients. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant was truly happy with their simple diet. Some scholars contend that they were so accustomed to it that they didn't know any better. Others argue that they were constantly hungry and that their lives were a constant search for food. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with a person's contentment being a matter of personal perspective. You, however, are now in the village. You are rationing your bread, a single slice a day, and you can feel your body getting weaker. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool, it's the simple ability to endure a lack of food. You've learned that a single meal, in its own way, is a kind of victory. The siege continues, and the animals are suffering just as much as the people. You now have a deeper understanding of the relationship between a human and their livestock, a bond that was a matter of life and death. The animals were not just a source of food, they were a part of the family, and a key part of the medieval survival plan. A mainstream historical fact is that a peasant family's wealth was often measured by their animals. A cow, a pig, or even a few chickens were a source of milk, eggs, and meat, and they were a kind of living bank account. The animals were also a source of labour, with a horse or an ox being a critical part of the farming process, a quirky and somewhat humorous tidbit is the use of animal manure as a source of heat. In a cold winter, a family might bring their animals inside, and the heat from their bodies and the warmth of their manure would help to keep the house warm. It was a kind of primitive central heating, a testament to the fact that in the Middle Ages you wasted nothing. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant was truly affectionate with their animals. Some scholars contend that the animals were simply a resource, a tool for survival. Others argue that there was a deep, emotional bond, and that a family would grieve the loss of an animal just as they would a family member. The truth is likely that it was a mix of both. A complex relationship between a human and a creature that was a key part of their survival. You, however, are now in the village. You are watching a family try to protect their last pig, and you realize that a human survival is tied to the survival of their animals. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool, it's the simple ability to care for another living creature. The siege is now in its final, agonizing days. The village is running out of food, and the people are getting desperate. You now have a deeper understanding of the importance of mending and repairing, a skill that was as much a philosophy as it was a practical task. In the medieval world, nothing was ever thrown away. A mainstream historical fact is that a person's clothing, their tools, and their home were in a constant state of repair. A torn tunic would be mended with a needle and thread, and a broken tool would be repaired with a bit of sinew or glue. This was a world without mass production, and everything a person owned was a valuable and often irreplaceable possession. A quirky and somewhat beautiful tidbit is the concept of a patchwork life. A person's clothing would often be a patchwork of different materials, a kind of living record of their life and their journeys. A patch from a traveller's cloak might be sewn onto a peasant's tunic, a testament to a trade or a kindness. Historians still argue whether the medieval person was truly content with this life of mending and repair. Some scholars contend that they were so accustomed to it that they didn't know any better. Others argue that it was a constant, back-breaking struggle. The truth is likely that it was a blend of the two, with a person's contentment being a matter of their own perspective. You, however, are now in the village. You are helping to repair a broken wall, and you realize that this is a kind of a sacred act. You are not just fixing a wall, you are fixing a community. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool, it's the simple ability to mend, to repair, and to care for what you have. The siege is finally over, but the world outside is a dangerous place. The roads are a mix of bandits, desperate travelers, and a general sense of lawlessness. You now have a deeper understanding of the danger of travel and the open road, a reality that made a short journey a major undertaking. A mainstream historical fact is that a traveler would often be armed, and they would often travel in a group for safety. The roads were often unpatrolled, and a lone traveler was a tempting target for a bandit. The dangers were not just from humans. A traveler could also be attacked by a wild animal, or they could get lost in an unfamiliar forest. A quirky and somewhat humorous tidbit is the concept of a traveler's prayer. A person who was about to embark on a journey would often say a prayer for a safe return. It was a kind of a final, desperate act of hope, a plea for a safe journey. Historians still argue whether the medieval person was truly afraid of travel. Some scholars contend that they were so accustomed to it that they didn't think twice about it. Others argue that every journey was a constant source of fear and anxiety. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with a person's fear being a matter of their own experience. You, however, are now in the village, and you are getting ready to leave. You have a new set of skills, and a new understanding of the world. You are not just a traveller, you are a survivor. You are a person who has learned to navigate a dangerous, unpredictable world, and you are ready to face the open road. The open road beckons, a different kind of battlefield. You've survived the siege, but now you must face the spectre of famine, the ultimate natural disaster in the medieval world. Famine wasn't just a lack of food, it was a slow, agonizing process that brought out the best and worst in people. This is the moment you must learn to survive when there is nothing left. A mainstream historical fact is that a medieval famine was often caused by a single, catastrophic event, a prolonged drought, a flood that wiped out the crops, or a sudden, devastating plague of pests. The result was the same. The granaries would run dry, and the people would be left with nothing. The first to suffer would be the poor, but the famine would eventually touch everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the wealthiest noble. A quirky and a bit of a grim tidbit is the concept of famine foods. These were not foods that were eaten out of preference, but foods that were eaten out of pure, unadulterated desperation. People would resort to eating things that were normally considered inedible, tree bark, wild roots, or even dirt. This was a last-ditch effort to keep a body going, a kind of grim, dark version of foraging. Historians still argue whether the medieval person had a deep knowledge of these famine foods. Some scholars contend that the knowledge was passed down through generations, a kind of insurance policy against a future disaster. Others argue that it was a desperate, hit-or-miss affair, with many people dying from a poisoning they didn't anticipate. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with a person's knowledge being a matter of their own luck and their family's history. You, however, have now seen it. You've seen the look in a person's eyes when they are truly hungry, a look that is a mix of desperation and a kind of terrible, empty resignation. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool, it's the simple ability to endure a lack of food. You've learned that a single meal, in its own way, is a kind of victory, a temporary reprieve from a hunger that can, and often does, kill. The famine has passed, but the world is still in a state of turmoil. You now have a deeper understanding of the importance of mending and repairing. A skill that was as much a philosophy as it was a practical task. In the medieval world, nothing was ever thrown away. This is the simple art of tanning leather, a skill that transformed an animal hide into a usable material. A mainstream historical fact is that tanning was a long, laborious, and incredibly smelly process. The process began with the hide being soaked in a mixture of water and ground-up oak bark or other plant materials that contained tannins, a natural chemical that prevents decay. This process would take months, and the hide would need to be constantly tended to, scraped, and re-soaked. The end result, however, was a durable, flexible material that could be used for everything from shoes to armor. A quirky and somewhat disgusting tidbit is the use of animal urine. The urine, when aged, would contain ammonia, a chemical that could help to soften the hide and prepare it for tanning. A medieval tanner would often collect the urine in a large vat, a kind of primitive chemical factory that was a critical part of the process. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice. Some scholars contend that it was a well-known part of the process, while others argue that it was a fringe practice that was only used in a pinch. The truth is likely a mix of both, with a person's knowledge being a matter of their own experience. You, however, are now in the village, and you are watching a tanner at work. You are watching a person transform a piece of raw meat into a usable material, a testament to the fact that in the medieval world, you wasted nothing. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool. It's the simple ability to mend, to repair, and to care for what you have. You've now seen the full spectrum of medieval survival, from the solo journey to the collective struggle. But now you must consider a new, and in some ways more profound, aspect of survival, the psychology of it all. How did a person endure a life that was so brutal, so short, and so full of hardship? This is the mental fortitude required to survive in the Middle Ages. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval mind was conditioned to expect hardship. A life of famine, disease, and war was a constant reality, and a person was taught to endure it with a kind of quiet, stoic resignation. This was a world where a person's faith was their greatest comfort, a belief that a better life awaited them in the next world. This was a way of coping with a life that was often unbearable. A quirky, and a bit of a comforting tidbit is the use of humor. In a world that was so grim, people found ways to laugh. They told jokes, they sang songs, and they found joy in the simple, mundane moments of life. Humor was a kind of a defense mechanism, a way to cope with a world that was so often cruel. Historians still argue whether the medieval person was truly a happy person. Some scholars contend that their lives were so short and brutal that happiness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Others argue that they found joy in the simple things, and that their lives were filled with a kind of a simple, honest contentment. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with a person's happiness being a matter of their own perspective. You, however, are now a part of this world. You've seen the hardship, and you've seen the resilience. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool. It's the simple ability to endure a lack of food, a disease, or a famine with a kind of quiet, stoic resignation. You've learned that a person's will to live, in its own way, is a kind of a weapon. You've now seen the full spectrum of medieval survival, from the solo journey to the collective struggle. But now you must consider a new, and in some ways more profound, aspect of survival, the legacy of it all. What can a modern person learn from a world that was so brutal and so short? This is the legacy of medieval survival techniques today. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the skills we've discussed, firemaking, foraging, and basic first aid, are still taught in modern survival classes. While we have the luxury of modern technology, the fundamental principles of survival are the same today as they were 1,000 years ago. A person who is lost in the woods today would have a lot to learn from a medieval peasant, a quirky and a bit of a beautiful tidbit is the fact that many of the skills we've discussed are now a part of a back-to-the-land movement. People are learning to grow their own food, to make their own clothes, and to live a simpler, more self-sufficient life. This is a kind of a spiritual and a physical return to a life that was once a necessity. Historians still argue whether the medieval person's life was truly a better one. Some scholars contend that it was a brutal, short, and often unbearable existence. Others argue that it was a simple, honest, and in some ways more fulfilling life. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with a person's happiness being a matter of their own perspective. You, however, are now a part of this world. You've seen the hardship, and you've seen the resilience. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool, it's the simple ability to endure a lack of food, a disease, or a famine with a kind of quiet, stoic resignation. You've learned that a person's will to live, in its own way, is a kind of a weapon. You've made it through the long, winding journey, and you've learned a valuable lesson in what it takes to survive in a world without modern conveniences. You've learned to build, to find food, and to deal with injury. You've also learned that survival isn't just about the physical, it's about the mental, the social, and the spiritual. You've learned that a person's will to live, in its own way, is a kind of a weapon, and you've learned that the most important survival skill of all is the ability to adapt. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval period, while often romanticized, was a brutal and short one. The average life expectancy was around 30-35 years, and a person who made it to old age was a rarity. This was a world where a person's life was often cut short by famine, disease, or war. A quirky, and a bit of a grim, tidbit is the concept of a death mask. In some cultures, a person's face would be covered with a wax mask after death. This was a way of preserving their memory, a final, desperate act of love. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice. Some scholars contend that it was a common practice, while others argue that it was a rare luxury. The truth is likely a blend of the two, with a person's wealth and status being a matter of their own experience. You, however, are now in the village. You have survived. You've seen the hardship, and you've seen the resilience. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool, it's the simple ability to endure a lack of food, a disease, or a famine with a kind of quiet, stoic resignation. You've learned that a person's will to live, in its own way, is a kind of a weapon. The journey is over. The long, winding path through the medieval wilderness has come to an end. You've faced hunger, cold, and a constant, low-level fear, but you've also found a community. You've learned new skills, and you've discovered a resilience you didn't know you had. The sun is setting, and the stars are beginning to appear. A familiar sight in an unfamiliar world. You are a survivor. You've just learned that the most important survival skill isn't a weapon or a tool, it's the simple ability to endure a lack of food, a disease, or a famine with a kind of quiet, stoic resignation. You've learned that a person's will to live, in its own way, is a kind of a weapon. The fire is dying down now. The embers are soft, warm glow against the deepening dark. The sounds of the village are fading, a soft hum of a life that is both ancient and new. Your eyes are getting heavy, and your thoughts are starting to drift. A soft river of memory and reflection. You can feel the weight of the day, the miles you've walked, the lessons you've learned. The world is quiet now, a soft blanket of darkness that feels less threatening than it once did. The rustling of the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, are no longer sounds of danger, but sounds of a world that is simply breathing. You are safe now, warm and secure, a part of a community that is also a part of you. You can let go of the fear, the hunger, the cold. You can rest. The past is a lesson, a story you have lived, but it is not a prison. The future is a promise, a soft, whispered hope that you will be here to see the sun rise again. You can close your eyes now. You are home, and you are safe. There is nothing left to fear, just the quiet of the night, and the soft, steady rhythm of your own breath. End of script. Sweet dreams.